There is a day that never makes the calendar. No date, no ceremony, no announcement. And yet, everything changes. Not because the world finally gave you an answer, but because the question quietly dissolved. You wake up and realize that the decisions you once carried like weight are no longer heavy. They don't demand courage. They don't demand confidence. They don't even demand explanation. They feel obvious. And if you stay with me until the very end, you'll understand why clarity is never something you search for. It's something that arrives the moment identity stops dividing itself. For most of your life, decisions felt dangerous, even small ones. What to say, where to go, when to leave, when to stay. Each choice felt like it carried consequences far heavier than it should, and you probably assumed this meant you were cautious, or thoughtful, or responsible. But beneath that story lived something else, fear of fracture. Because when identity is unstable, every decision threatens to split you further. One choice satisfies one version of you, another choice satisfies another. And whichever path you take, a version of you feels abandoned. This is why decisions used to feel personal, not practical, not neutral, personal, as if choosing wrong would say something final about who you are. So you hesitated, you researched, you waited for signs, you asked others what they would do. Not because you didn't know, but because knowing felt too expensive. Indecision is rarely about lack of clarity. It's about refusing to let an old identity die. And this is the grief no one prepares you for. The grief of outgrowing yourself. Because every decision is a quiet funeral. A version of you that once felt necessary no longer fits. And when you resist that ending, you call it doubt. You call it overthinking. But it is simply mourning delayed. Neville Goddard never spoke of decision-making as logic. He spoke of state. Because when the state is fragmented, decisions feel like threats. But when identity integrates, decisions stop asking for defense. They don't feel like leaps, they feel like alignment. And alignment doesn't shout, it settles. What if the reason decisions felt terrifying was never the risk of choosing wrong, but the certainty that choosing right would end a version of you forever? There was a man, we'll call him Aaron. Aaron had spent years unable to decide. Jobs, relationships, cities. He lived in a permanent state of almost leaving, almost committing, almost choosing. People told him he was cautious. He told himself he was waiting for clarity. But clarity never came, until one morning something strange happened. He didn't feel confident. He didn't feel inspired. He just felt finished. Finished debating, finished rehearsing futures, finished asking himself who he should be. He made a decision that day, quietly, no announcement, no drama. And afterward, the most surprising thing happened. There was no relief spike, no excitement, just silence. Later he said, "I thought deciding would feel like jumping. It felt more like standing still for the first time." This is the texture of integrated decision-making. It doesn't feel bold. It feels clean. Pause here for a breath. If you felt this quiet shift, where decisions no longer feel like battles, leave a short declaration in the comments. I trust what feels obvious. Then let the movement continue. Doubt is often praised as intelligence. People say, it's good to question. It's smart to hesitate. Only fools are certain. But doubt is not wisdom. It is fragmentation. Doubt appears when too many versions of you are competing for the steering wheel. One wants safety. One wants expansion. One wants approval. One wants rest. And while they argue, life waits. This is why doubt feels exhausting. Not because decisions are hard, but because identity is split. Neville taught that once the assumption is made, movement follows. Not because you push, but because there is no longer internal resistance. Resistance is not external, it is internal contradiction, and contradiction breeds doubt. When identity integrates, something subtle happens. Alternatives lose emotional charge. They still exist, but they stop pulling you. You don't feel tempted. You don't feel afraid of missing out. You simply don't resonate. This is what clarity actually feels like. Not certainty, neutrality. The absence of inner noise. And neutrality is terrifying to the ego, because the ego survives by weighing options, by dramatizing outcomes, by staying relevant. When decisions become obvious, the ego loses its purpose, and it will try to convince you something is wrong. This is too easy. You're being careless. You're not thinking enough. But what you're experiencing is not recklessness, it's completion. When something inside you is complete, it no longer negotiates. It moves. What if doubt was never protecting you, but protecting the version of you that didn't want to be replaced? This is why people around you start to notice a change. They say you're calmer, less reactive, harder to sway, not stubborn, just settled. You no longer ask 10 people what they think, not because you don't care, but because your center is no longer outsourced. And this is where decisions gain weight without heaviness, because they come from identity, not emotion. Emotion fluctuates. Identity doesn't. So when a decision arises, it doesn't feel urgent. It feels timely. And timing is different from urgency. Urgency is fear-based. Timing is alignment-based. You stop rushing. And yet, life moves faster. Not because you accelerate, but because resistance is gone. And if you feel this internal quiet forming, if decision-making is starting to feel simpler, not louder, there is a 21-day challenge for Create Your Dream Life available in the description. Not to teach you what to choose, but to stabilize this identity so clarity remains natural even when pressure appears. Explore it only if it resonates. Now, let's continue. Right decisions rarely feel heroic. This disappoints people. They expect fireworks. Certainty, a rush of confidence. But alignment is understated. It feels like relief without celebration. Like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years and realizing you didn't even notice you were holding it. This is why people sometimes mistake clarity for apathy. They worry something is wrong. Why don't I feel more excited? Why isn't this bigger? Because excitement belongs to pursuit. Alignment belongs to arrival. When you arrive, you don't clap, you sit down. And when identity integrates, decisions feel like sitting down. They don't demand courage. They don't demand validation. They don't even demand explanation. You simply act. And action doesn't feel like action anymore. It feels like continuity. What if the right decision feels so ordinary that the ego calls it boring? This is where regret dissolves. Regret needs comparison. It needs an imagined version of you living a better life somewhere else. But when identity integrates, there is no alternative self to envy. There is only the path you're on, and it feels sufficient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's uncertain, because uncertainty is no longer personal, it's just life moving. This is the freedom most people don't expect. Not freedom from challenge, but freedom from inner accusation. You stop asking, "Did I choose wrong?" Because the question no longer applies. There is no wrong for an integrated self, only movement. Here is the truth that was promised at the beginning. Decisions become obvious when identity no longer needs permission. You used to ask, "Is this allowed? Is this safe? Is this acceptable?" Those questions belong to an older identity that needed approval to exist. But that identity has softened, and in its place is something quieter, something complete. This is not confidence. Confidence still needs reinforcement. This is finality, not an ending, but a settling. And when something settles, it doesn't argue. It moves, quietly, naturally, without announcement. This is why your life may feel simpler now, not easier, simpler, less internal noise, less negotiation, less self-betrayal disguised as patience. If this feels familiar, if decisions have started to feel obvious, not forced, that is not a phase, that is integration. And if this way of living resonates, if you want to remain close to this state, stay aligned, not by chasing answers, but by choosing environments that reflect who you are now. Subscribing here is not about content, it's about coherence, about staying near a frequency that doesn't pull you back into fragmentation. Because from here on, life will not ask you to decide loudly. It will simply invite you to walk. And you already know which direction feels obvious.